Go live in the streets, you ungrateful failure, my father roared, slamming his heavy mahogany door in my face. He thought he was banishing a penniless freelancer. He had no clue my quiet tech company pulled in 52 million last year. So, I bought his massive, secret debt instead. The dining room of the Brighton estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, always smelled of lemon polish. Sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table, I felt like a ghost haunting my own family. I was 28, dressed in a muted grey sweater I'd bought at Target specifically for these occasions, playing the role they had assigned me years ago. Christina the disappointment. Christina the struggling freelance coder. Christina, the cautionary tale. At the head of the table sat Arthur Brighton, my father, a silver-haired real estate tycoon who treated his children like corporate assets. He was currently holding court, swirling a glass of Macallan 25. To his right was Sylvia, my stepmother, dripping in Cartier and polite disdain. To his left was Preston, my 24-year-old half-brother. Preston was the golden child, a boy who had never heard the word no and possessed the business acumen of a golden retriever, albeit with none of the charm. So, Christina, Sylvia purred, cutting into her duck. Are you still doing those little computer gig things? We saw a lovely position open up at the front desk of Arthur's downtown building. It comes with health insurance, dear. I'm doing fine, Sylvia. The freelance work pays the bills, I replied, keeping my voice mild, my eyes fixed on my plate. My father snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound that rattled the crystal wine glasses. Paying the bills in a shoebox apartment in Queens, perhaps. It's an embarrassment, Christina. I have colleagues asking what my eldest daughter does, and I have to tell them she fixes laptops for pennies. I didn't live in a shoebox in Queens. I maintained a sparse studio there as a mailing address for my father's benefit, driving up in a 10-year-old Honda Civic whenever I was summoned. It was a carefully constructed facade, a moat I had built to protect my peace. Leave her alone, Dad, Preston chimed in, though his smirk betrayed him. Not everyone is cut out for the big leagues. Speaking of which, the new venture capital pitch is looking solid. We just need to close the bridge loan. This was the real reason I had been summoned. I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift, the predatory focus of the Brighton family turning toward me. Arthur cleared his throat, leaning forward. Actually, Christina, that brings me to why I asked you here tonight. Preston's new app, the Luxury Concierge Service, is on the verge of a breakthrough. But the bank is being unnecessarily rigid about the short-term capital. They want additional guarantors. My stomach tightened. I don't understand. You own Brighton Enterprises, Dad. You have hundreds of millions in commercial real estate. Why do you need another guarantor? A brief, almost imperceptible shadow crossed my father's face. A flash of something that looked remarkably like panic before his mask of arrogant authority slammed back into place. Liquidity. Christina, you wouldn't understand complex corporate finance. My assets are tied up in new developments. Preston needs a simple signature. I want you to co-sign the collateral agreement. I stared at him, genuinely bewildered. You want me to co-sign a loan for Preston? Dad, you just spent the last 20 minutes mocking my income. The bank isn't going to care about a freelancer's signature. You have a clean credit history, Arthur snapped, his patience evaporating. And I know your grandmother left you that trust fund, the $50,000. The bank will accept it as a good faith secondary collateral line. It's a formality. You won't pay a dime. The $50,000. The only thing my late mother's mother had managed to leave me, explicitly locked away from Arthur's grasping hands until I turned 25. He had been furious about it for years. Now, he wanted to risk the only safety net he thought I had to fund Preston's third failed startup. No, I said quietly. The silence in the room was absolute. Sylvia dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against the fine china. What did you say to me? Arthur's voice dropped to a dangerous, low rumble. I said no, Dad. I'm not putting my grandmother's money on the line for Preston. His last two companies went bankrupt in under a year. I'm not co-signing anything. Preston slammed his hand on the table. You selfish bitch. Dad has given you everything, and the one time the family needs a tiny favor, you hoard your pathetic little inheritance? Given me everything? I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. He cut me off at 18 because I wouldn't major in what he wanted. I paid my own way through MIT on scholarships and 3 jobs. I haven't asked you for a single cent in 10 years. Arthur stood up, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He threw his napkin onto his plate. How dare you speak to me that way under my roof? You arrogant, useless girl. You think you're so independent. Rotting away in your squalor? You are nothing. You have achieved nothing. Arthur, your blood pressure, Sylvia murmured, though she was looking at me with pure venom. If you are not willing to support this family, then you are not part of it, Arthur roared, pointing a trembling finger toward the grand entryway. I am sick of looking at your miserable face. Get out of my house. I am cutting you out of the will entirely. You won't see a single cent of the Brighton Empire. I stood up slowly, meticulously pushing my chair back. I looked at Preston, looking smug and victorious. I looked at Sylvia, already calculating how my share of the inheritance would look in her bank account. And finally, I looked at my father, a man so blinded by his own ego he couldn't see the reality standing right in front of him. Get out, he screamed, his voice cracking. Go back to your miserable life. Go live in the streets. For all I care. You will die penniless, Christina. You'll be begging me for help within the year, and I will step right over you. I picked up my cheap canvas tote bag. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried over Arthur Brighton since I was 19. Instead, a strange, cold calm washed over me. Goodbye, Arthur, I said, dropping the title of Dad for the last time. I promise you, I will never ask you for a dime. I turned and walked out, the mahogany door slamming shut behind me with the finality of a judge's gavel. As I walked down the sweeping cobblestone driveway toward my battered Honda, I didn't feel broken. I felt liberated. Because Arthur was right about one thing. I didn't understand complex corporate finance the way he did. I understood it much, much better. The drive from Greenwich to Manhattan took just over an hour. I parked the rusted Honda Civic in a long-term garage in the Bronx, tossed the keys to the attendant who knew me only as Sarah, and walked 2 blocks to where a sleek, black Mercedes Maybach S-Class was idling at the curb. The back door swung open before I even reached it. Rough dinner, Miss Brighton? Asked David, my driver and executive security detail, his voice a smooth, calming baritone. You have no idea, David. I sighed, sinking into the plush leather seats and shedding the itchy grey sweater. Take me home, please. The real one. As the Maybach glided toward the glittering skyline of Manhattan, I opened my encrypted tablet, the cheap disguise of the evening falling away. I wasn't Christina, the struggling freelancer. I was Christina Brighton, the sole founder and CEO of Aegis Cyberworks, a premier B2B cybersecurity firm. When my father cut me off at 18, I didn't just survive. I weaponized my intellect. I built encryption algorithms in my dorm room. By 22, I had patented a zero-trust network architecture that caught the attention of the Department of Defense. By 25, I had sold enterprise-level licenses to 3 of the 5 largest banks on Wall Street. I never took the company public. I never did press interviews. I operated entirely through proxy LLCs and airtight NDAs. The tech world knew Aegis. They didn't know Christina Brighton. Last fiscal year, after paying my staff and reinvesting in R&D, my personal take-home revenue was $52 million. I could have bought Arthur's Greenwich estate with cash and bulldozed it for fun, but I kept it hidden. I knew if Arthur found out, he would either try to claim credit for my success or, worse, find a way to bleed me dry. But tonight, he had drawn a line in the sand. He had thrown me out. The masquerade was over. The car pulled into the private subterranean garage of my Tribeca penthouse. I took the private elevator up to the 52nd floor, stepping into a massive, glass-walled expanse overlooking the Hudson River. Waiting for me at the marble kitchen island, surrounded by glowing monitors and financial documents, was Liam Harding, my chief financial officer and closest confidant. Liam was a former Goldman Sachs shark who had grown bored of traditional banking and found my ruthless efficiency refreshing. "You're back early," Liam noted, not looking up from his laptop. "I take it the turkey was dry and the company was toxic?" "Arthur kicked me out," I said, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. "Officially. Cut me out of the will. Told me to go live in the streets." Liam finally looked up, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Dramatic. Did you tell him his net worth is currently a fraction of yours?" "No," I smiled, a cool, dangerous expression. "I thought of something better. You remember that distressed asset portfolio we were looking at, the one from Sterling Financial? Aegis generated massive amounts of liquid capital. Rather than letting it sit, Liam and I had recently formed a private equity arm to buy up distressed corporate debt for pennies on the dollar, restructure it, and flip it." Liam tapped his keyboard. "Yes, the Sterling portfolio. It's mostly toxic commercial real estate loans. High risk. Why the sudden interest?" "At dinner tonight, Arthur mentioned he had liquidity issues. He was begging me well, demanding me to use my grandmother's tiny trust fund to co-sign a bridge loan for Preston. It didn't make sense. Arthur owns Brighton Enterprises. He should be swimming in collateral. Unless—" Liam's eyes widened. He immediately understood where I was going. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up financial databases and corporate registry files. The room was silent except for the frantic clicking of keys. "Brighton Enterprises," Liam muttered, his eyes tracking lines of data. "Private company, but I can see their public filings and debt registrations. Oh, wow. What is it?" I asked, walking around the island to look over his shoulder. "Christina, your father isn't just having liquidity issues. He is drowning," Liam said, a note of genuine shock in his voice. "He heavily leveraged his existing properties to build that massive luxury complex in Chicago, but the supply chain crisis delayed it by 2 years. The interest rates on his variable loans skyrocketed. He's completely underwater." "How bad?" "He's in default on 3 major covenants," Liam replied, highlighting a block of text in red. "He owes $48 million in balloon payments by the end of the quarter. And guess who holds the primary mezzanine debt on his most variable assets?" I leaned in, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. "Sterling Financial." "Exactly," Liam said, leaning back in his chair. "Sterling Financial bought his debt from his original lenders 6 months ago, but Sterling has overextended themselves, which is why they are packaging these distressed loans and trying to sell the entire portfolio quietly to private buyers. They want to offload the risk before Brighton Enterprises officially files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy." I stared at the screen. The man who had just screamed at me, who had mocked my supposed poverty, who had threatened to let me starve in the streets, was 30 days away from losing his entire empire. He had been projecting his own terrifying financial ruin onto me. "What happens if someone buys that debt portfolio from Sterling?" I asked softly. Liam looked at me, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "If we buy it through our holding company, we become his primary creditor. We hold the liens on all his properties. We can call the debt in immediately. And when he can't pay, we seize the assets." I finished. "We foreclose on Brighton Enterprises. We own him." The silence in the penthouse felt entirely different from the silence in the dining room in Greenwich. This wasn't the silence of oppression. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. "Liam," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I want that portfolio. I don't care what Sterling is asking. Offer them a 10% premium for an expedited, all-cash close. Put it under our shell company." Obsidian Holdings. I want it finalized by Monday. It's an aggressive move, Christina. It's a $50 million play. I made $52 million last year, I replied, turning to look out at the glittering lights of the city I had conquered in secret. Consider this a personal expense. Arthur told me to go live in the streets. I think it's time I bought the streets he lives on. By Monday morning, the Tribeca penthouse felt less like a home and more like a war room. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the financial district, but my eyes were locked on the array of monitors spanning the mahogany dining table. The wire transfer just cleared through J.P. Morgan Chase, Liam announced, his voice tight with adrenaline. He hit a key, and a green confirmation banner flashed across the primary screen. $50 million, liquid cash, transferred from Aegis Cyberworks reserve accounts into the holding shell of Obsidian Holdings. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I took a sip of black coffee, the bitterness grounding me. And the legal transfer of the covenants? Kirkland and Ellis finalized the paperwork an hour ago, Liam said, sliding a thick, leather-bound folder across the table. Sterling Financial was practically crying with relief to get those toxic assets off their books. They didn't even ask who the principal of Obsidian was. As of 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Obsidian Holdings is the primary senior creditor for Brighton Enterprises. I opened the folder. Page after page of legal jargon, amortization schedules, and collateral liens. There it was, in stark black and white. The deed to the Brighton Tower in Manhattan, the luxury residential development in Chicago, the commercial parks in New Jersey, all of it pledged against the debt that I now owned. As I traced my finger over my father's signature on the original loan agreements, a cold, familiar knot tightened in my chest. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been capable of this kind of ruthlessness. 2 years ago, I was still holding on to a shred of hope that my family, or at least the people I let into my life, could be trusted. Back then, I was quietly scaling Aegis, while dating a charismatic investment banker named Simon. I had confided in Simon about my algorithms, my wealth, and my quiet life. Then came Preston's second massive failure. A disastrously mismanaged transportation operations and logistics firm. Preston had burned through millions of Arthur's money trying to disrupt the freight industry, only to end up drowning in unfulfilled contracts and union lawsuits. Desperate, Preston had gone to Simon, and Simon, the man I loved, had secretly taken the proprietary logistics software I had designed for a defense contractor and handed it over to Preston's company to try and save it. The betrayal had gutted me. It wasn't just the theft of intellectual property, it was the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the man I loved colluding with the brother who despised me. I crushed the transportation operations company with a single cease and desist from my lawyers, burying Simon and Preston in NDA violations. Simon vanished, and Preston ran crying back to Arthur, who naturally blamed me for sabotaging his son. The heartbreak had been agonizing, a physical pain that kept me awake for months, but it had also burned away the last of my naivety. The Christina who cried over betrayal died 2 years ago. The Christina who remained was forged in ice and silicon. "Christina," Liam said, breaking me out of my thoughts. His tone had shifted. It was no longer triumphant. It was deeply concerned. "There's a complication, or rather, a massive liability we just uncovered in the data Sterling sent over." "What kind of liability?" I asked, my focus snapping back to the present. When I was auditing the secondary collateral lines Arthur tried to establish last week for Preston's new app, I found a bridge loan application submitted to Wells Fargo. Liam turned his monitor toward me. "Look at the guarantor's signature." I leaned in. It was a scanned PDF of a standard commercial loan application. The primary applicant was Brighton Enterprises, but down at the bottom, under secondary guarantor, collateral pledge, was my name, Christina Brighton. And next to it, pledging the $50,000 trust fund from my grandmother, was my signature. Except I hadn't signed it. My blood ran cold, then immediately boiled. "That's a forgery," I know it is, Liam said grimly. The metadata on the PDF shows it was generated from Arthur's private office IP address on Saturday morning, the day after he kicked you out. Arthur had demanded my signature. I had refused, and he had simply forged it anyway. He was so accustomed to absolute control, so desperate to keep his house of cards standing, that he had committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to access my grandmother's money. He was willing to ruin my credit and steal my only known asset just to fund Preston's delusions. He crossed the line, I whispered, the words tasting like metal in my mouth. He didn't just disown me. He tried to destroy me, technically, since we bought the entire debt portfolio and assumed the position of his primary banking relationship. This forged application is now legally in our possession, Liam noted, tapping his pen against the desk. We could hand this over to the FBI right now. Arthur would face 10 to 15 years in federal prison. I stared at the forged signature. Prison was too clean. It would make him a martyr in his country club circles. No, I said, a slow, predatory smile forming on my lips. I don't want him in a cell just yet. I want him in a boardroom. I want him to look his failure in the eye. I closed the leather binder. Draft the default notices, Liam. All of them. The Chicago property, the Manhattan Tower, the Greenwich estate. Trigger the acceleration clauses. As of today, his loans are fully due. He has 48 hours to pay us $50 million, or we seize everything. And the board meeting? Liam asked, a glint of dark amusement in his eyes. Send a courier. Obsidian Holdings formally requests an emergency meeting with the CEO and board of directors of Brighton Enterprises this Friday at 10 a.m. The Brighton Enterprises Tower in Midtown Manhattan was a monument to my father's ego. 60 stories of sleek, reflective glass, with a sprawling lobby lined in imported Italian marble. For 28 years, I had walked into this building feeling like an imposter, a disappointment summoned to the principal's office. This Friday morning, I walked in like I owned the place. Because, legally speaking, I did. I wasn't wearing my cheap Target sweater. I wore a bespoke, razor-sharp charcoal suit from Savile Row, paired with a silk ivory blouse and Christian Louboutin stilettos that clicked with rhythmic authority against the marble floor. Flanking me were David, my head of security, and Harrison Cole, a terrifyingly sharp corporate litigator from Kirkland and Ellis. Top floor, Miss Brighton? David asked, pressing the button for the executive elevator. Straight to the boardroom, David, I replied, my pulse remarkably steady. On the 60th floor, the mahogany double doors of the executive boardroom were slightly ajar. I could hear Arthur's voice echoing down the hallway, laced with a frantic, desperate energy I had never heard before. I am telling you, gentlemen, it is a minor restructuring hiccup. Arthur was practically shouting. Sterling Financial panicked. They sold the debt to this shadow entity, Obsidian Holdings. But it means nothing. We have the assets. We just need a short-term capital injection to appease them. I pushed the doors open. The boardroom was a tableau of wealthy panic. 12 board members, mostly older men in expensive suits, sat around the massive oak table, looking distinctly nauseous. At the head of the table stood Arthur, sweating profusely, his tie loosened. Next to him sat Preston, looking pale and thoroughly out of his depth. The room fell dead silent as I walked in. Arthur's eyes bulged. The colour drained completely from his face, only to rush back in a violent, angry crimson. "Christina!" he sputtered, genuine confusion warring with his innate rage. "What in God's name are you doing here? How did you get past security?" He looked me up and down, taking in the tailored suit, the confident posture, and the two very serious men flanking me. For a split second, his brain couldn't process the visual data. It didn't fit the narrative of the penniless freelancer he had banished. "I asked you a question," Arthur barked, slamming his fist on the table to regain control of the room. "This is a closed executive session. You were disowned, Christina. You have no business being in this building. Security. Cancel that, Harrison, my lawyer said smoothly, stepping forward and tossing a thick stack of legal documents onto the center of the oak table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. Who the hell are you? Preston demanded, trying to sound intimidating but failing miserably. My name is Harrison Cole, partner at Kirkland and Ellis. I am representing the majority stakeholder and primary senior creditor of Brighton Enterprises, Harrison said, his voice carrying the calm, lethal weight of a man who destroys corporations for a living. The board members began muttering among themselves. One of the older investors, a man named Richard who had known Arthur for decades, leaned forward, his face pale. Kirkland and Ellis? Arthur? What is going on? Are they representing Obsidian Holdings? Yes, Richard, they are, I said, stepping up to the edge of the table. I locked eyes with my father. And to answer your question, Arthur, I'm here because you invited me, or rather, you invited my holding company. Arthur gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Your holding company? What kind of sick joke is this, Christina? You fix computers for minimum wage. You don't have a holding company. Actually, Arthur, I said, my voice eerily calm, projecting effortlessly across the massive room. For the last 6 years, I've been the sole founder and CEO of Aegis Cyberworks. We provide zero-trust network security to Wall Street. Last year, my personal net income was $52 million. Obsidian Holdings is my private equity arm. A collective gasp echoed around the boardroom. Preston looked like he was going to be sick. Sylvia, who had been sitting quietly in the corner observing the meeting, dropped her designer pen. That's a lie, Arthur stammered, his bravado finally cracking. That's impossible. You're a failure. I am the person who just bought $48 million of your toxic, defaulted debt from Sterling Financial. I interrupted, my voice turning to ice. I own the liens on this building. I own the liens on the Chicago development. I own the mortgage on the Greenwich estate. You are in default on 3 separate covenants, Arthur. You missed the balloon payment 48 hours ago. Christina, please. Richard, the investor, pleaded, standing up. We can negotiate. We can offer equity. There is no negotiation, Richard, I said, not taking my eyes off my father. Arthur told me last week to go live in the streets. I decided to take his advice. I'm taking all of them, including the one this building sits on. Arthur seemed to shrink before my eyes. The imposing, terrifying titan of industry who had tormented me my entire life was suddenly just a desperate, heavily leveraged old man in a tailored suit. You can't do this, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. I'm your father. You would destroy your own family? You destroyed this family, I corrected him. And just in case you thought about fighting this in court. I gestured to Harrison, who pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase and slid it directly to Arthur. It was a copy of the Wells Fargo bridge loan application, with my forged signature. We found this in the secondary collateral audits, I said softly, leaning over the table so only he and Preston could hear the venom in my voice. Wire fraud, identity theft, federal offences. If you fight me on this foreclosure, Arthur, I won't just take your company. I will hand this document to the SEC and the FBI. You will die in a federal penitentiary. Arthur stared at the forged document. The fight completely left his body. He collapsed into his leather executive chair, burying his face in his hands. A pathetic, broken sob escaped his throat. Preston was openly weeping, babbling something about his luxury app. I stood tall, surveying the wreckage of the Brighton Empire. The ghost had finally exorcised the haunted house. Harrison, I said, turning away from the men who had once been my family. Begin the asset seizure protocols. Evict them from the Greenwich estate by Monday. Clear the building. Yes, Miss Brighton, Harrison replied. I walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The air in the hallway felt lighter, cleaner. I pressed the button for the elevator, a genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. The fallout was swifter and far more brutal than even Liam had projected. By Monday morning, the news of Brighton Enterprises' catastrophic default had leaked, painting the front page of the Wall Street Journal. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Tribeca penthouse, watching the sunrise bleed across the Manhattan skyline, while Liam read the headline aloud. The bold, stark serif typography on the screen felt like a physical weight being lifted off my chest. "They're calling it the Midnight Massacre of Midtown," Liam mused, taking a slow sip from a crystal glass. We were celebrating with a perfectly mixed old-fashioned, the bite of the bourbon and the bitter orange resting smoothly on my tongue. The financial world is in a complete panic trying to figure out who or what Obsidian Holdings is. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing for 48 hours. Arthur's former associates, rivals, and supposed friends were desperately scrambling to uncover the face behind the shadow entity that had systematically dismantled a real estate titan in a matter of hours. "Have they fully vacated the Greenwich estate?" I asked, turning away from the window. "They're finishing up now," Liam said, checking his tablet. "Harrison has security teams on site to ensure they don't take any structural fixtures or protected assets. But there was a development early yesterday evening." I raised an eyebrow, leaning against the marble kitchen island. "What kind of development?" "Sylvia," Liam said, a dry, humorless smirk playing on his lips. "It seems your stepmother didn't take the news of Arthur's impending poverty very well. According to the security team logs, the moment the reality of the foreclosure set in, she packed 6 massive Louis Vuitton trunks, called her own private car service, and left him standing in the driveway. She apparently shouted that her prenuptial agreement guaranteed her a certain lifestyle, and since he could no longer provide it, the marriage was void." I shook my head, swirling the ice in my glass. I couldn't say I was surprised. Sylvia's loyalty was exclusively tied to the balance of Arthur's checking account. Rats fleeing a sinking ship. And Preston, crying in his bedroom until the movers physically carried his mattress out from under him, Liam replied, his tone lacking any sympathy. "But Christina, there's one more thing, a twist I honestly didn't see coming. Arthur tried to make a final desperate move this morning before the courts opened." Liam swiveled his monitor toward me. It displayed an intercepted Swift network transfer log, lines of code cascading down the black screen. "Arthur had a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands," Liam explained, pointing to a highlighted string of data. "He tried to wire $12 million to a shell company in Panama at 4 a.m. He was trying to hide liquid cash before the corporate bankruptcy audits finalize. 12 million? I set my drink down, my eyes narrowing. That's a direct violation of the asset freeze injunction Harrison filed on Friday. It's a federal criminal offense. "It is," Liam agreed, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "But the irony is almost too perfect. Do you know which offshore bank he was using to route the funds?" "Crestview International." I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the name wash over me before a sharp, genuine laugh escaped my throat. "You have to be kidding me." "I am not." Liam grinned, tapping the keyboard. Crestview International was a boutique offshore bank that had suffered a catastrophic data breach 3 years ago. Panicked and hemorrhaging clients, they had hired Aegis Cyberworks to entirely rebuild their security infrastructure. My team and I had designed their new transaction compliance algorithms to prevent international money laundering. I knew that code inside and out. I had written the core framework myself, weaving the digital tripwires together with the meticulous, layered precision of complex embroidery. Our automated systems flagged Arthur's transfer as a high-risk, unverified breach of a court-ordered asset freeze. I said, a profound sense of poetic justice washing over me as I realized exactly what had happened. "We blocked his own transaction." "Exactly. He tried to hide his last remaining millions, and your algorithm instantly froze the entire account." locked him out, and automatically forwarded the transaction logs to the Department of Justice, Liam said, closing his laptop with a decisive snap. It's checkmate, Christina. Total and complete. 2 weeks later, the dust had finally settled. Brighton Enterprises was officially dissolved. Its profitable assets were seamlessly absorbed into Obsidian Holdings, and its toxic properties were slated for liquidation. I stood on the sweeping cobblestone driveway of the Greenwich estate. It was a crisp, clear morning. The massive stone mansion, once a suffocating symbol of my father's absolute control and my own agonizing inadequacy, stood completely empty. The silence was deafening, but for the first time in my life, it felt peaceful. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. A rusted, 10-year-old Honda Civic pulled up the long driveway, looking hilariously out of place next to the perfectly manicured hedges. The engine sputtered before dying completely. The driver's side door groaned open, and Preston stepped out. He looked entirely different. The bespoke Italian suits and arrogant swagger were gone. He wore a wrinkled polo shirt and faded jeans. His face was pale, his eyes sunken from obvious lack of sleep. The golden child had been violently introduced to reality. He walked toward me slowly, stopping a few feet away, unable to meet my eyes. He stared at his scuffed shoes. "David said you wanted to see me," Preston mumbled, referring to my head of security. His voice lacked its usual mocking edge. It was thin and raspy. "I did," I said, my voice perfectly neutral, betraying zero emotion. "I heard you applied for a junior logistics coordinator position at one of Obsidian's newly acquired shipping firms. You tried to leverage your experience from your failed transportation operations company." Preston flinched visibly at the mention of his catastrophic failure. "I need a job, Christina. Dad is facing federal indictments for the wire fraud and the Cayman's account. His lawyers abandoned him. He's living in a cheap motel by the interstate, waiting for the FBI to arrest him. Sylvia is gone. The venture capital guys won't even return my phone calls. I have nothing." He finally looked up at me, his eyes brimming with desperate, pathetic tears. "I'll sweep floors in the warehouses. I'll do data entry. Just, please. I don't know how to do anything else. We're family." I looked at my half-brother. I thought about the decades of relentless mockery at the dinner table. I thought about the excruciating pain from 2 years ago, when he colluded with Simon to steal my life's work. I thought about him sitting in that boardroom, cheering as Arthur threw me out and told me to live in the streets. "We share genetics, Preston." "We are not family," I said, my voice cold, absolute, and unyielding. "You burned through millions of dollars playing pretend, stepping on anyone in your way because you thought there were no consequences. Now, you get to learn what it actually costs to build something from the ground up." I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a single, sealed white envelope, extending it toward him. "There is a certified check in here for exactly $5,000. It is enough for a security deposit on a modest apartment and 1 month's rent. It is the exact amount of money I had in my bank account when Arthur cut me off at 18. Preston took the envelope with a trembling hand, staring at it as if it were a live explosive. "Do not ever contact me again," I told him, turning my back on him. "And Preston? Don't spend it all in one place. The streets are a lot colder than they look from the penthouse." I walked up the sweeping marble steps of the estate as Preston got back into his battered car, my old Honda Civic, which I had legally transferred into his name as a final, permanent parting gift, and drove slowly back down the driveway, disappearing through the iron gates. I pushed the heavy front doors open, stepping into the grand foyer. It didn't smell like lemon polish and roasted duck anymore. It smelled like fresh paint, empty space, and limitless opportunity. Next week, the contractors were arriving. I wasn't going to live here. I was converting the 50-room mansion into the headquarters for the Aegis Foundation, a fully funded incubator and housing program for young, underprivileged women pursuing degrees in STEM and cybersecurity. I was already working on the branding, stripping away the ornate, oppressive Brighton family crest and replacing it with clean, modern typography that signaled a new era. Where Arthur had hoarded wealth and projected fear, I was going to build a fortress of intellect, support, and independence. The heavy mahogany doors of the Greenwich estate closed one final time, not shutting me out, but permanently locking away my past. I didn't end up on the streets. I bought them. Arthur's empire of cruelty ultimately fell to the daughter he so carelessly discarded. True power isn't loud, arrogant, or demanding. It operates quietly in the silence, building a fortress so impenetrable that when the inevitable storm finally arrives, you simply become the roaring thunder.